right, so there was a little pause in the room, so that's usually a good time to start. Welcome, everybody, to the 2019 Reckless Ideas Speaker Series. It's a collaboration between Generator, which is where we are right now, the Master's Program in Emergent Media at Champlain College, and the UVM Complex Systems Lab. So there's three people who are kind of in charge of running the series. Chris Thompson is in the back. He's the executive director of Generator. Myself, Robin Perla from Champlain, and Juniper Lovato, who is with UVM and is home with the flu. But Jane's here from the Complex System Lab. So if you have any questions about the UVM Complex System Lab, Jane Adams is our in-house representative. And a member of Generator and a graduate from the Emergent Media program. So she's very well versed in the whole thing. Sorry. So the idea of this series is to find people within our own communities, so from Champlain community, from the UVM community, and from the Generator community and entrepreneurs at large who are kind of thinking recklessly about things and about the intersection of art, technology, enterprise, community. And so tonight we have from Champlain College, Ann DeMarle, who is certainly thinking recklessly and brilliantly about all of those things. So for those of you who don't know Ann, she is an associate dean at Champlain College and the director of the Emergent Media Center, though on sabbatical this year. The Emergent Media Center actually is located just across the parking lot in Lakeside. If you've never been there, you should come visit us. She was also the founding director of the Masters in Emergent Media and some of the college's first degrees mixing art, technology, and design, such as the trio of game degrees in design, art, and programming, as well as the multimedia and graphic design program. She's also the founder of the Governor's Institute of Vermont in Information Technology, which is a summer institute for high schoolers. So Ann launched the EMC with the mission of bringing Champlain students media and technology expertise to business and nonprofits looking to explore and create new solutions. During her 10 years there, 11 years now, I think. 15? No, really? No, for the Emergent Media Center. Really? That long? Wow. She has been deeply involved in projects such as the UN-sponsored award-winning Breakaway Game and youth camps addressing violence against women, 2 Robert Wood Johnson-funded games for cystic fibrosis patients, a Ford Foundation project where users learn to make business decisions to solve rural economic inequities, and VR projects that build on narrative, activity, and sensory experiences. So much of Ann's work has been involved in the integration of education, arts, and technology, which is, I think, what we're going to talk about now. Perfect. And so, as I had already said, she's founded many highly successful interdisciplinary and experiential programs that promote lifelong education. Key to each program is an understanding that students are entering into a complex world wherein creativity, collaboration, and critical thinking hold the keys to solving our critical cultural and environmental challenges. So I think probably that might be a little bit of what we're going to talk about tonight. So I'm really excited about it. If all of that wasn't enough, Ann is also an accomplished designer and artist, a skier, a kayaker, and breeder of Springer Spaniels. So, okay. So the rules. So we know that you'll have some burning questions that you're really excited to ask about. Do your best. If it's a question that you can save until the end, please do. Obviously, if there's something that that can't wait, we'll let it slide maybe once. But we want to make sure that Ann has a chance to give her whole presentation. So try to save your questions to the end. And also, in the spirit of making room for everybody, make sure that when you're asking questions, you're making space and time for everybody to get a chance to ask questions. So if you have follow-up questions, we're going to have, the bar will stay open if you didn't get a chance to we have Polar Spring beverages and some beers and ciders on tap tonight. Donations are welcome. And there'll be some food, I think, coming, yeah? Pizza. So come for the talk, stay for the conversation afterwards. So if you have a burning question that you didn't get to ask during the talk, there'll be plenty of time for conversation. We hope you'll stay and mingle, collaborate, and we'll let the reckless ideas fly. So, and with that, here's Ann DeMarle.
Hi, everybody. I would like to start, not with an which I just started with, but I'd like to start by saying that I've been working on this particular presentation for roughly 2 or 3 weeks now, and I haven't read it out loud yet. So I apologize in advance, but I'm also so excited because for the last year I've been working on some certain ideas I have in my head about education and about technology and learning. And this really gave me a chance to look at putting it all together in some kind of form. So as I told my friend John, it's probably more a book, so I apologize ahead of time, but I'll try to be succinct. So as was said, I direct the Emergent Media Center, where currently we're asking the big questions at that intersection of art, technology, and communication. And I'm so glad to see my alumni going off and doing the same thing. Hence, even here at Generator. While we actively are creating technology to address some of our deepest questions, such as on how to create sustainable, livable communities and how to motivate environmental action, how learning through play can address deeply ingrained social issues such as violence against women and girls and gender bias, and though it may sound simple, but it's not, how we can create engaging, transformative experiences. But today, I'd like to focus on some of my learnings on the dual nature of computing, the nature of emergence, the questions these pose, and how we can take on the future, creating both gritty individuals and innovative communities through something I've just recently learned is called connected learning, which I've been doing for at least 20 years now. So let's take a look at affordances. This concept was first coined by James Gibson in researching visual perception. And it's been since applied to other areas, including technology and education. At its most basic, it states that the world is perceived not in terms of shapes and spatial relationships, but in terms of the possibilities they provide us for action. So therefore, our perception drives our action. So what I'd like you to do for just a second, for a couple minutes, is I'd like you to turn to, turn to somebody next to you. Whoa, sorry. Turn to somebody next to you, and looking at fire, and think of about 4 different things you think fire affords us, just like those early people did. Just turn to somebody and come up with a list of 4 if you could. Okay, I hear laughter. That's a good thing. So I'm going to cut you off. I know we're a creative group. Here's a list that I came up with. How many of heat? Any hands? Heat, light, energy, purification, destruction. Did I leave any out?
Well, creation.
Creation. Yep, sure. Pottery, for instance. Yeah. Glass. Transformation. Okay. Oh, romance. Thanks, Tony. Yes. It's very true. Where would we be without candlelight, right? So when I look at this list, I also think about the duality of the nature of fire. So for instance, here's one of my Springer Spaniels, Charlie, and he's keeping himself nice and warm by the fire. So he's appreciating that heat and warmth. But we can also look, at the aftermath of the fire bombings of Hamburg, Germany. That was an act of revenge, killing an estimated 50,000 people. So, okay, now take a deep breath. What I believe we're seeing here in duality is the principle of yin and yang. And it offers us a good perspective because it's not a value judgment that's assigned. Instead, it expresses the idea of two opposites that attract and complement and yet are contained each within the other, with neither superior. Now I'd like to take a minute and consider the duality of the affordances in computing. So at the base level, I think of computing's duality lies in the fact that it's a human creation composed of both the hardware and language. In fact, years ago when I had my own business, my sister, who is now a game writer, I employed her to work on something for IBM, and she could instantly learn to code because she's a writer. She totally grabbed on to the kind of syntax you need for writing code, besides also writing all the copy. So it's both hardware and languages. So what would you think are the affordances of these two coming together? You could either turn to who you were just talking to, or you can come up with a list in your head. Anybody want to turn? Why don't you turn to neighbor and then...
Software and hardware coming together?
Yeah, software and hardware. Yep, computing. Anyway. Wow, fire was easier, I guess. Okay, this is good. Momentum is growing, so I'm going to cut you off again. All right? And so I want to turn to someone who I consider one of our great thinkers and educators on technology. She's a designer and the futurist and the author of Hamlet and the Holodeck, Janet Murray. In her book, Designing the Medium, which I apologize to all my MFA students who did not take that class with me, she looks at 4 components for computing. She says it's procedural, so it's based on rules. It gives you action based on rules. It's participatory, which invites you to manipulate and to take action. It's encyclopedic, which is pretty, I think I knew that the first day I got my CD-ROM that had the encyclopedia on it. And then it's spatial. And I think right now we're really breaking into that with VR and things like that, where we can navigate both information and virtual spaces because of computing. So I break it down into these new forms of, well, they're not new forms of interaction, but they're forms of interaction that we now have available through computing. So we have interactivity, we have replication, which is a big one, networked information, participation, connectivity, amplification, and now we're looking at artificial intelligence and what that brings us. So from each of these, again, the dual nature of computing emerges, providing for either good or ill. And therefore, it gives us some unexpected human advantages and behaviors. So next I'd like to quickly turn to not too quickly, the idea of emergence and how it comes out of duality and affordances. So I love this little video of the snowflake because that is a visual definition of emerging. It's shapes arising and creating new shapes that are greater than what came before it. What's interesting about emergence is you can't break it back down to the two components anymore. It's created something totally new. So 1 + 1 no longer equals 2. Instead, they create something entirely different. And anybody who's in the complex systems group understands that that's a basic underlying principle of complex systems. So, as one who disliked typing as a teen, I was afraid I would be a typist the rest of my life. And I think I got a C in that class. And that was really because of my own clumsiness at the computer. However, it is a machine, and it's an IBM, you noticed. IBM has definitely emerged since then. It exhibited two of Murray's affordances, both the procedural, it acted on rules, the machine did a certain thing, and it invited us to do something, which was to type. And there's me in my first job as a computer graphic artist, where I never thought I could afford a system. I mean, the systems took up whole rooms, and this was a newer generation of computing. So the addition of both the code and the hardware to just your keyboard, that's how computing emerged. So though at first it wasn't networked. So with this, the affordances grew, and we get to add the spatial onto non-network computing. As can be seen, I was making a 3D map. Isn't that cool? But now, look what we have. We have them in our wrists, on our hands, everywhere. And that's because we've merged mobility to computing, and we've merged networking with it. And we've entered into, the Internet of Things, or as geeky people like to say, IoT. It's simpler. So we've just beginning to take full advantages of computing's affordances, those 4 affordances, and we're still discovering what that means for us. But alongside computing, and that's me as a graduate student. So all my alumni know what I was doing as a graduate student. I was standing on a stool and painting. So alongside computing, art also evolved. Once, it was primarily for the expression of the creator and for viewing by the audience. And you could also maybe say as a means of status, if you owned it, right? I have a Picasso. I wish I had a Picasso, but I don't have a Picasso. But if I had one, it's a status symbol. So, but as technology comes along, what we see is now art is also an experience not just for the creator, but also for the audience. And so it's gaining some of the same kind of experiences that computing. So it's marrying art with computing and opening up a whole new list of things we can do. The principle of emergence also allows us to see art and communication gave birth to technology, seeding dramatic social change. I just love how the language breaks down. It's just perfect. But I think it's also true, and I'd like to run you quickly. I'll try to go quick through this story, because it's a long story, because it starts with our cave paintings. And cave paintings originally were about coalescing community. So if you've ever read Karen Armstrong, I highly recommend her. And she describes it, that as a youth, you would go into these caves with our candlelight, our fire going, and with a shaman and the community. And it was about these paintings would leap off the wall as if you were in the hunt. And so it was a means of strengthening the youth in a coming-of-age ceremony so they could take on their role as now an adult and a hunter. We leap ahead 9,000 years, give or take a few thousand, and the next major innovation of this merger of art and communication was cuneiform text. Literally, images become icons, though at the time primarily as an accounting tool and to maintain order. You can then add another 2,000 years, the time's compressing, you can see, and vowels were groundbreaking. I'd say vowels were a major groundbreaking event. And they formed the alphabet. And the first pieces we find, for instance, are this vase, and it's got a poem on it. It says, "Whoever of the dancers now dances lightly, he shall get me as his prize." So also as a game developer, designer, I like that it's about games as well. And so we could be expressive with our words because we added vowels. We weren't just counting crops anymore. But literacy still belonged exclusively to the scribes and powerful. Clay tablets, papyrus to the manuscript, they reinforced hierarchical power, especially of the Catholic Church and of royalty and wealthy patterns. And there was still this big divide between those who could and couldn't read, right? Or even experience them. But the true culture shift became because of the Gutenberg press, as we all know this, I hope. And it dramatically shifted power, because for the first time, everybody could somehow get to the content. At first, it was translated into German, and then it was read to people around, your dinner table or over friends, those who could read. And so it really changed that balance of power and caused the Reformation. And likewise, it caused the scientific revolution, because for the first time, deep thinkers could publish their research and they could build upon each other's work. Okay, now it was 9,000, 2,000, now we're going 400 years, all right? And the telegraph breaks out. And what it really did was it really broke our sense of time and space. It totally tore that out. You didn't have a horse you didn't have to get on a horse, or you didn't have to walk. You could get this message. And it's really interesting, especially considering how we're always instantly messaging right now. And the Baltimore Sun said, "Time and space has been completely annihilated." It's amazing, right? But it wasn't really totally welcome. I love this Thoreau quote, because he was talking about us. He said, "We are in great haste to construct a magnetic telegraph from Maine to Texas, but Maine and Texas, it may be, have nothing important to communicate." Right? So there was still this disruption. It disrupted a power system again. Which brings us to today. A computer, right? In the new forms that we're experiencing because of that, where we can not only use them to communicate, but they communicate to us, they communicate to each other, and it's creating new kinds of intelligences. Part of what has been amazing for me to witness in my life is the speed of that change. I mean, I still remember when it would take a month to render an animation, or when I almost caught a business on fire because my drive burnt up that I just worked on and had to carry there to put my animation into their system. I had to go home and redo it. But anyway, but now look at it. Facebook only launched 15 years ago, and the iPhone launched in 2007. And computing's become very pervasive in all of our lives. It's this pervasiveness that poses some real questions that we need to address as a society, with the jury still out on that for good or ill of the affordances and the inherent duality. The questions that reach deep into making us human. So if you could just take a minute, you can do it yourself, and just think for a second, what are some of the questions you think is being posed by this, by current technology? I'm going to go through a list of my questions, but just think for a minute. Anybody got a thought they want to share? Yeah.
I feel like starting to see things, we're getting really good at seeing things very quickly, taking in more information, but it's affecting our attention span.
Mm.
And we're not taking things in as deeply, but we're getting more at a shallow level.
Okay, that's great. Okay, yeah.
So they become very dependent on some of the
Yeah.
The boundaries between our physical and our digital world and what they are and where.
It's really good. Yeah, really good. There's no wrong question here. So here's a few that I started looking at. And I look at it through the lens as both a designer and as an educator. And so, for instance, how do we prevent echo chambers and digital bias? As educators and designers, how do we develop technology and media that benefits all strata, supports diversity, knowledge sharing, and innovation? And are there structures and processes that we can use to support this? Another one, what is privacy? I just got this in my email the other day. What is privacy, security? What are the potential impacts of AI? What can we learn from our digital natives regarding their perspective growing up with it? AKA, is rock and roll really that bad? Just putting it out there. So another one, what's the nature of learning, play, and work in pervasive technology? I don't know how many people know how to play Go in the room. Does anybody know how to play Go? Oh, there's a few. It looks amazingly complex to me. And you can see here, the computer, they've already learned how to play at superhuman levels, and they're using it without any human knowledge. They're teaching themselves how to play Go. And they had previously done it by using human knowledge to defeat a human player, but now the computer can even beat that. So that's pretty amazing, right? This computer is playing and learning. And as educators and designers, understanding that we can just look about any information and that the future is really undecided, what is our role as both a designer and an educator? And then what are the environments that create community and what are those that create isolation? This quote I love by Shirley Heath, an educator. She says, I think the piece I like the best is, she says, the interconnections offered by the internet, though certainly sufficient in deliberation that a community needs, does not encourage this kind of interaction, truth and civility. Hence the decency, trust, responsibility, and ongoing engagement that sustain a community become improbable, if not impossible. And that was written in 2003. So I think that's especially what we're seeing with some of our young people, especially these days. So as designers and educators, how do we ensure technology doesn't separate us, but instead supports our social bonds, the community of the commons, right? And how do we deal with our own duality? My understanding is it's our duality. It's us giving these things the affordances and taking advantage of them. So if that's the case, how and who accepts responsibility to design and educate for good? And how and who determines what is good? Is it Google or the ethics team at Twitter? Really, it's good, right? So how do we teach for an uncertain future? I'd like to introduce you briefly to Gen Z. Anybody in this room a Gen Zer? Nobody? Well, across the street at the EMC or up the hill on the campuses, you'll find just a few. They were born around 2004 when Facebook was born. Like I like to say, radio, I was born after radio. They get to say, I was born after Facebook. And so they are really being shaped by what is out there. So here's some things about them. They're now entering college. 25% of our population, they're larger than the baby boomers. They are 54% in the US, 54% Caucasian, 24% Hispanic, 14% African American, 4% Asian, and 4% multiracial or other. They're fiscally pragmatic, socially they support same-sex marriage, transgender rights, and gender equality. They've always had the internet. And non-school work, they're on the internet 3 hours plus a day, not including school. And 95% of the teens own phones. 80% expect to attend college, which is good for us in the college business, but also causes problems. But they learn online. By 2015, approximately 150,000 educational apps to choose from for them to learn. So that's not even online learning, that's an app that they're learning from on your phone. They're independent and entrepreneurial, yet they're risk averse. I'm not sure how those mix, but that's what they say. And forget lemonade stands, they're building their businesses using the internet and web tools. And they expect mobility and immediacy. They would not get the telegraph. And they're bonded to their devices, to their question, is their exobrain, right? They form relationships online, girls primarily through social media and boys primarily through games, but that's a primarily, it's not an absolute. Loneliness, anxiety, and fragility, girls seem to be more affected than boys, they think, maybe due to social media. Cyberbullying is a thing of their lives. But interestingly, they prefer person-to-person communication. So they might just, might be counteracting. So by 2030, I hope to be retired. But they will be fully in the workforce when, as the Washington Post recently reported, robots could replace nearly a third of the workforce. My husband, Jim, and I have discussions about this all the time, about the opportunities. We're not going there today. But I will look at this. One of the places I look, so when I design degree programs or educational programs, I do a lot of research. And I often turn to, first, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, but projections can be problematic. So for instance, when I created the game degree program, guess what? There was no statistics for game designers. None. They had no projections for them. And even still today, what you have to do is you have to really look under the categories and say, oh, designer, yeah, that would fit. Oh, programmer, yeah, that would fit. I mean, it's very complicated, but it can, I think, point to major trends that they're predicting. But another place I like to look, I search for interesting perspectives. Like this report, it gets really creative, imagining potential jobs. So, for instance, a trash engineer, earthquake forecaster, medical mentors, which I find really interesting and I think has already started in some degrees. Organ body part creator. Honestly, if I was growing up today, that's the one I'd want to be. I really would. 3D, biology, it's all together there, okay? I also look at things like the Future Skills Report, which calls out that jobs require human skills, or as we like to call it at Champlain, the human touch. Anything that machine might not be able to do. And futurist Brian David Johnson, who's been here a number of times, he wrote that anything that humans are really good at doing, okay, that can protect one's career from automation. Although I find it problematic because when I first became part of the workforce, we were all talking about information workers. Well, what happens to an information worker when the information's all on your device? So, questions. As a teacher and educator, I like to look not necessarily at the specific careers, but at the types of skills and strengths that we need to contend with what we're looking out towards. And a guru I like to read and look at is Howard Gardner, and he first coined the concept of cognitive types in the 5 Minds for the Future. He believed, this is interesting what he said, he believed formal education and formal educational institutions will continue to be crucial, but much of education will occur via distance learning, networks of individuals, groups, or self-instruction. So my fundamental question, really, still as an educator, is how do we educate when computing is rapidly changing the nature of who we are as a society, how we interact, communicate, and learn, and shifting our cultural paradigms? Or as this one educator, who I can't pronounce that first name, but Educator Thayer, points out that the biggest challenge for the future of education is that it often comes up short in preparing students to wrestle with intractable problems and unending disruption, right? And I think that classroom model, that old classroom model, which was great if you were going into manufacturing or you couldn't get a textbook because the smartest place in the room was the teacher. It just doesn't apply anymore. So I look at it, you can look at what are the affordances of education. And I should have asked you all to make your own list, but I didn't. I saved you this time. And I look at one, this is just a fast one I put together. Obviously at Champlain, everybody these days wants career opportunities. You know, people are afraid of losing all their money sending someone to college. Mastery of content, the ability to parse information, the ability to collaborate and to connect, the context, understanding context and critical thinking, asking the right questions, and developing character. I think those are some key things we need to look to education to reinforce and to provide or enable the student to achieve. John Dewey, who, as we all knew, grew up in Vermont, he was the father of experiential learning, and he believes that education is an opportunity for establishing cross connections between content and life, and that the best type of education puts the student in the habit of finding points of contact and mutual bearing. With the speed of change and the affordance of technology, I wonder what he would now add to this question. A recent article in Higher Ed stated, what is the role of the instructor if he is no longer the authority in the classroom? How do you evaluate students when there's no right answers? How do we teach in an uncertain future? So I want to turn to a methodology for education that really I just learned in the last few years, has a name called connected learning. But honestly, we've been developing for a long time at Champlain. When I first began my teaching career, it was when computers were just becoming adopted. So there I am, they're not networked, and I had to enable students to learn both the design concepts and at the same time how to understand how to use a computer. So there was a lot of kind of copy, paste. Look at this menu. Now you guys try it over here. I mean, it was that kind of learning situation. It's what we might call the sage on the stage, right? But to me, today, the sage on the stage is just another version of the Marlboro Man. I don't know how many people are familiar with that advertising, right? So he's a myth, right? He's that big macho guy out on his own who smokes a cigarette and can take on the world, right? And so in the sage on the stage is born when a professor literally was the only knowledge. They didn't have textbooks. So where would you get your knowledge, right? But coming out of industry and working as a special ed aide when I was in my early 20s, I knew that there was more and incorporated more experiential learning and group work into my classes. And the emphasis on experiential and collaborative teaching methods is now called the flipped classroom or the guide on the side. And I still think both of these methods have their time and place. It's a great improvement, guide on the side, but it also reminds me of the show Father Knows Best. Anybody know the show Father Knows Best? I mean, he was always ready to come in with the answers and to set everything right? And it still depends on that idea that we know more than they do. But I think that that's not true. First of all, we don't have their context of growing up in a digital world. And perhaps not their creativity. And information is coming out at them from all places as our different viewpoints, right? Who says our viewpoint is the right viewpoint? So guide on the side assumes I know where I'm going, and frankly, we don't. In my mind, a professor needs to be a co-learner with the student, needs to actively discover and refine the questions needing to be asked. Here's an example. This was just this week. A friend of mine on Facebook who's a professor of video, not at Champlain College, in which she and the student disagree about the format for video. And as you can see, She's from the older school, and she says it's got to be horizontal, and the student's saying, no, it's got to be vertical, and then the student says, but look at this, it could be diagonal, right? And it's interesting because we communicated online about this, and I looked it up, and actually people, or corporations are now promoting that we do vertical video, and that 80% of video is now relayed as a vertical format. So what should we teach? Both, I think, and we should learn. So the teacher needs to be a co-learner. And I also look at what I learned with the Governor's Institute when I first started that program. It was those teens that let me know we needed a game program. I could see how engaged they were in gaming. I knew what they wanted to be when they grew up. I knew there was no way to do it currently in higher ed. So students become our teachers. And then I found in my career that it's powerful to learn from students. And then we need to embrace technology as a source of information and rely on what we can provide that it cannot. I'm old enough to know when Wikipedia was frowned on by everybody. And I don't know about you, but it's one of the first places I verify things and go down the source and then look back in their logs. But anyway, and in respect to humanity and relationships, I like what Brene Brown in her new book, Dare to Lead, says. She says, what do we have to offer that machines and AI can't? And she says, empathy, connection, and courage. Those pieces that make grit, I think. So the fourth key to connected learning is the idea of community. And that's where a lot of experiential learning or situated learning falls short. It's still contained in a classroom setting with a professor and networks, but how do you draw in the community? As a model, it refers to both social relationships and emerging digital and network technologies. Its strength is founded on experiential learning, but also on making things happen. And it links student interest and passion with peers, expert, and community to utilize both virtual and actual connections. And this creates opportunities not only for the student, but also helps the community learn and grow. Most importantly, and nod to Lori, because she said this in a meeting, and I was like, yes! I said, most importantly, it places the student right in the middle of the learning opportunities. So this model of a learning community, I think, looks more like the murmurations of starlings. Isn't that beautiful? And their ability to adopt and change and thrive with the environment and in response to it. And they're very successful species, by the way. They aren't going extinct. They might be a problem, but they're not extinct. As Ashley Montague points out, with few exceptions, the solitary animal is, in any species, an abnormal creature. The dominant principle of social life is not struggle for existence, but cooperation. And what makes a better society? Cooperation. And in higher ed, and often in online as well, still today, we ask students to work alone in a competitive atmosphere on a regular basis, to compete with each other, but not to input with each other. I still remember as a teacher asking my students, finding out from my students, it was really important that I knew their name, but they didn't know the names of more than 3 other students in the room. How do you change that dynamic, right? So I'm very excited about this, the model of connected learning, especially how it's been developing at the EMC, where we partner with industry, institutions, and nonprofits in a studio to develop new concepts, processes, and uses for media, or I like to call it the alt classroom. And here, we, using appreciative inquiry, we came up with our vision statement, which we're a fearless learning community designing dynamic processes and tools to create meaningful solutions. At the EMC, our community, how we define community is actually from local to global, from those with questions to those who are experts in the field. And what we're doing is creating a feedback loop for knowledge and skill acquisition. And again, turning to Gardner, this time his theory of multiple intelligence is very powerful because we need to embrace the individual strengths. We're also helping to build those that are weaker, but we embrace them for who they are and how they can contribute. And our processes are, of course, informed by game design thinking, how could I not? How do we provide meaningful challenges and understanding what true rewards are for a learner? And when looking at challenges, I believe we should address the big, wicked problems, those really difficult to define and understand. Such as Bill Gates came up with this list just in the last month of what the world needs now, or working towards solving the UN sustainability goals, pushing ourselves and our students out of our comfort zone, and knowing that as a community, we learn and we collaborate and we can do amazing things. So these challenges, we are met through the concepts of collaboration and mastery. What I've discovered in a lifetime of collaboration is really how difficult it really can be and how desperately we need to understand it in order to solve our biggest problems. I've gained a deeper understanding through my friend, who I did not know would be here, and my dear friend and mentor, John Abeley. John, who, among his many things, he founded FIRST. He was one of the founders of FIRST, and he Boston Scientific, and he found a submarine using collaboration. So that's pretty amazing. And so I've just got two things from him here. What are the different forms of collaboration, the different types of collaboration, and how they can be employed and when? And then I love this, the different types of collaboration, command and control, facilitated, self-organizing, egalitarian, adversarial, pseudo, mass, crowdsourcing combinations. And really what I've learned from him is success depends on different strategies and leadership. This has all come into play in the center. Another thing to consider is the question of what technology affords the learning processes. So if we go back to our earlier list, or the one I came up with, on educational affordances, the career opportunities down, it's helpful if we pair those with the technology affordances. So what can support what? And to what extent? And I think it's a good way to start looking at when we employ technology for learning. And finally, with the connected learning model at the EMC, it builds upon design thinking and reflection. Although I have to put one thing out here, because design thinking often wrongly states it's okay to fail. And I think when we're working with diverse students, we have to understand that for some populations, failure is not an option. Failure means loss of a scholarship, or loss of a job, or loss of something that we can't comprehend. But we can look at design thinking and look at how we can build up and create by building together, understanding who it's for, testing it, reflecting it, and then improving upon it. So, and then that reflection and integration being a critical piece. And then finally, I don't have the audio on this, but this is a fun video because it's one of our students, and he's explaining how Veresis works, which was our VR surgery piece that we did. So he's telling the rest of our students how it works. And finally, at the EMC, we ourselves are constantly learning. I think Sarah Jerger could tell you that for sure. We're always saying, okay, what's happening now with this group? What do we need to modify? How do we reach out to them? How do we break down our own boundaries as a team? And how do we collaborate better? And how do we apply our new knowledge? So we've never really 100% gotten it right. We just keep working on it with these goals in mind. But our success is really our students' success, which I think points for their bright future. Remember, I'm going to be retired. But yeah, I mean, there's so many stories we could tell you about how well our students have done and what has impacted them and where they're going. So that is my talk. Anybody can get a copy of the slides. I'll be posting them. And these are a few of the takeaways, the 5 main takeaways from this talk. 6, 5. Thank you.
We have mics. We are recording it, so we ask that you use one if you have a question. But we do have some time for a few questions, and then we'll break out for. I should be using the mic. We have mics. We should use them. We're recording. We'll take some time if there are some questions for the group, but then we'll break out for pizza and beer and seltzer and conversation as well. So if you have a question, raise your hand, and Chris and I have mics that we can pass around.
Could we turn the lights up a little so we can see questions, or is that forbidden?
Thank you. Extremely fascinating range of elements. I teach at the University of Vermont, and an awful lot of our classes are like 100-person classes in rows. Samuel Johnson, 1750, said that the lecture was outdated because people could read. How do we deal institutionally with making more of these kinds of interactive and responsive kinds of structures at work? I always keep my class, our classes are somewhat smaller. I always teach in a circle, but I've learned some ideas here that I want to apply.
Right. You know, I think that's a really tough question, to tell you the truth, because we're looking at physical models of delivery, right, as well as delivering the information. And even here today, I couldn't employ my own speaking. Right? I couldn't send you off into groups to work on something together. So I think there's a time and place, actually, for a lecture. But I also think that an institution can build on that. One of the things I'm excited about Champlain is our centers of experience. So, for instance, we depend on a lot of our students coming to us with already having classroom work. And it's different types of classroom work, but they're really gaining expertise. And then we're able to draw in both their professors, diverse students from across the institution to work on problems. What we'd like to do more of at the EMC is to be able to have professors come and work directly with their questions, so that we could get more of that cross connections between not only the students but the faculty as well. I applaud your openness. It's a tough call, right? Yeah. Anybody else? That's a good question. Yes.
Oh.
Okay, thank you. Very interesting in regards to classroom education. I'm in industry, as most of us probably are, and one of the things I struggle with is keeping these concepts alive in industry, because collaboration and learning and innovation doesn't stop with the college diploma. And to be successful, what you describe about, very insulated, linear, competitive situations apply even more in corporate America than in a classroom. And so how do we increase, or have you given thought to how we increase the collaboration and innovation within industry?
I was able to co-teach a leadership class 2 years ago, looking at some of those questions and looking at industries that were able to employ or do employ those models of collaboration. And I think I was fortunate because I did have an earlier career in corporate life, and finding the teams that could work on a problem together was critical in building across. I bet you John has more ideas than I do, but I think it increases your competitive advantage, to tell you the truth, when you can and where you can. And then there's even little things. John, what's the company in Vermont that we took the class to, where Biotech, where one of the interesting things they do, for instance, is they have different roles, but then they will change roles. They'll switch. So each employee gets to understand and become a master of different articles. Or also at the hospital, I noticed in oncology, the same thing is happening, where the oncology nurses have different roles all through the unit. And it creates both, I think, I could be wrong, but a sense of collaboration between the nursing and staff, but it also allows them to be aware of when anything could potentially go wrong, because they are so connected that they can respond quickly. So maybe one week they're working directly with the patients, another week they might be working to input the patients. It all switches, so they're doing different things. I think that's, it's a different kind of collaboration. I think we could go back and look at the slide with the different types of collaboration and how that plays out. And especially today in the corporate world, where not only you might not even have your team at your physical place. My brother just took a job at Citibank, and none of his team works in the same building. They're all around the world. So what are the technology systems we put in that could create that collaboration? I know at EMC, we have different kinds of problems like timing of students. Like this student can't be there because they're in class, and this student can't be there. And so we depend a lot on some of our technology tools. We use something called Trello, for instance, to keep that communication open.
You may have almost just answered the question I was about to ask, which is, we get to the two sides, which is people are not necessarily needing to go to classes anymore. You mentioned online education and things like that. How do you still change all of that collaboration now that people are even further apart? Any approaches that are more successful or not? I mean, an app seems a good start, but like anything else?
Right. Yeah. I think we really can use our technology. I think first, when I look at it, what's the human component of that technology? So is there, like when they're talking about that medical guide, so you have the technology, but is there a person that's also helping to guide that process? So for instance, in game development, there's the game developers, but then there's also the people who are working on the social media, that are their fan base. They're actively integrating the fan base, which can be thousands and millions of folks, and trying to get them all at the same point, So how do we use technology, especially now, instantaneously? How do we react to that would be some of my questions. When I had my own business, because I was like you, an animator, none of my clients were all over the world. I mean, I worked a lot at the time with IBM, and I was working with researchers all across the world. So syncing up how we work together, and for me even to understand what I was supposed to be animating was really important. So using the tool sets to make that collaboration happen. And I think knowing your goals and what are your challenges. Are you sharing the same goal set? Are you looking at the same challenge? How do you hold on to that and define it? You might have a better idea than that, right?
I've lived it.
You've lived it. Paul was one of our first partners at EMC when he was at IBM, and we
did a virtual reality project scheduler where time was collapsing forward.
Right. It was pretty awesome, actually. And it was all about that. Actually, it was a great VR piece before you had to wear the headsets about how do you find where the missing links are on the collaboration points, right? And where are the dependencies? How do we track the dependencies? If this person isn't getting this, the whole team. So I loved it. It was a great project. Yeah.
A question in the back.
Hey, Ann. I have a question for you that goes all the way back to your earliest days as a teacher, and you and I have had a little bit of this conversation one-on-one. I'm really curious what you see to be the potentials and the pitfalls of these new modes of learning and these new ways of understanding the world when you put it in the context of different kinds of learners. So thinking about how different brains learn, thinking about what it might mean for all students to feel like they had the room to fail. What do you see as the potential and the pitfall of these new models as they come into a landscape with all different kinds of learners?
Yeah. So if whoever is leading, and I'll use leadership as an example, can't put that framework in place, then it becomes really difficult. As I said, when I first started, I was 21 years old, and I was a special education aide. I would drive from Lincoln, Vermont, South Lincoln, Vermont, to New Haven, to Starksboro, all in 1 week, and I'd work with everybody from pre-K to sixth graders. And what was really interesting, and so at that time, I had the whole span that we now have names for, that we didn't then. We were just beginning to put names on these children, these diverse learners. But it was really interesting to me because technology was just starting too. And where in the world was Carmen Sandiego was right now. And I cannot tell you how excited some of my students who were almost nonverbal would get when they could play Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego. Or I would take those same kind of, and I didn't realize I'd have a career in game development at that point. I'd take those same students and I would create these learning on paper instances that were games. So they could mark their own progress and rewards and they could see their path. So when we're working with bigger groups, and we've had a lot of students with diverse mindsets at the EMC, and one of the things I'm really proud of is, for instance, we had one student who was practically nonverbal, and now he's at Microsoft as a researcher, as a programmer. But he was able to work with all these other students, and he was able to gain the skills of cooperation and collaboration. He would never be a normal person, but they probably didn't want a normal person, right? They wanted him for his genius, right? And the fact that he could collaborate and communicate. So I think in a diverse classroom setting, that happens. Another example is we had a student, and he was one of our first EMC students. His name was Brian, and now their name is Liz. And what was interesting when we first started, he wanted us to be there. This was a he then. He wanted us to make sure we were involved in these different activities in the college to include accepted student stay. He at the time was like, we need to get more people like us here. and it really rings with me now, but what he meant was a group of people who are open and diverse and could work together on some of these problems. And so I think it's really dependent on the leadership to make those spaces and to learn how to employ them and to work with and to learn from their students. Another time, but this was very interesting, when I was heading GIB a long time ago, we had two students in 1 year, one who was diagnosed as autistic and one who wasn't. And we had this rule that they weren't allowed to be on cell phones or any kind of device. We wanted the kids to get together, right? And one of the RAs came to me and said, and so-and-so is just, at lunchtime, is always in the corner on his cell phone. And I was like, oh, what do I do? So I needed to go. So I depended on my community to alert me to things that needed to be looked at. And I went and sat with him, and I discovered that he was watching MIT lectures. So I was like, wow, this is really interesting, right? So I realized this student needed kind of a different way of being. And the other interesting thing at GID was that we always would end in this challenge. You could tell them into challenges. And they would work together as a group and design something to address like environments or whatever. And at that year, we were looking at water. Impending water shortages, right? And so I gave these two a choice to not be part of the group, which they embraced. And I also gave them a choice whether they wanted to present on stage or have something that people could interact with. One chose one chose the other. And so I was taking a risk because I'm like, oh, I got this young man with autism is going to lecture with a full auditorium of parents who've never met him before. What trouble have I got myself into? But he was great. So I think this combination
there was like two more hands, so maybe one question here and one question.
So I have a question about, right here. I have a question about emergent aesthetics. So what we've watched recently with everyone having cell phones that can become basically television stations, as well as the really slick stuff coming out of the production studios today, students, modern kids have changed their aesthetic of what is a good content. So Casey Neistat of YouTube would basically describe it as there are 4 qualities of aesthetics that have emerged in modern video. And I want to ask, those are, for example, authenticity, spontaneity, integrity, and positivity. If you have those qualities, then people will love your stuff, right? So given that everybody's walking around with a Skillshare or Udemy or whatever it is that they use to study, what are the new emergent aesthetics of education such that we can attract those students who are already immersed in old school style teaching but are already living Khan Academy flipped up down schools, right? So what are the emergent aesthetics of education for the next generation?
Well, I think those are some of the questions I'm asking, you know. It points right to that teacher with the video, right? Or, for instance, when, I used to do, multimedia presentations for presidents of corporations. And I used to do video, right? And we were said only enough words on the screen that you could read in 3 seconds, or whatever it was, right? That's an old format for an old type of participation. And one of the strengths I believe the EMC has always brought is that our students are growing up in those aesthetics and we're learning from them.
I was going to say, they bring the aesthetic.
Yeah,
so the
we
students
do.
are bringing the
Yeah,
aesthetic.
yeah.
We don't deliver the aesthetic.
Yeah, exactly, because, back, again, a while ago, when World of Warcraft was really big, you look at the screen and go, what is that mess? But it's all about communication, right? But if you were trained the way I was, classically, you go, no way. So you have to learn from them, and you have to see what it's affording them, too, right? I had another example. So, for instance, everybody knows about Burlington that we created with the UN, but it was our students who designed that, and it works. It just works. We've done a lot of research on it, and it changes people's perception of gender inequity. I couldn't teach them that. We surrounded them with experts and mentors and feedback from children of all different persuasions, but they're the ones who figured that out. Man, I couldn't teach that. They had to learn together, and I learned from them. And so that's what's cool about being a teacher, right? You get to keep learning all the time. It's my answer. It's probably not the right answer.
And there was a question over there.
So my background is science and medicine, and I'm fascinated by many of the technologies that are emerging. What's being done, in your opinion, about helping students understand the implications, the ramifications, social, political, of their creations? How do you maintain compassion, for instance, sympathy, empathy?
Right, yeah. Again, I'm going to point to one of my core colleagues here. I really do believe in interdisciplinary education for that reason. It's also why I believe you have to let students get feedback from other people and not just live in their own little bubble. They're just students, although I just said how genius they are, and they are, but their brain is at a place in development that's not fully formed. And I believe, and maybe this comes from dogs, but it's how you treat them, it's how you develop, how you model it, that they can learn benefits over time or in their own lives, right? And I would say that, for instance, cyberbullying, what's going on with that bully? Why is that bully bullying? What's going on behind that we don't see? And who's the person who can reach out to work with those students? And years ago, I had a former student, also a former friend of my daughter. She got online on Facebook, and she'd been in a wedding of a friend of hers, and she started on Facebook tearing apart how the wedding went. was one of the bridesmaids. So I instantly got on there and said to her, so do you realize what you're doing and what the repercussions are? So we have to be courageous too. And you know, there are some human traits. There are human traits that we need as educators to bring forward, especially now.
I lied, there's one more question, and then we'll break for comments.
I love what you've presented, and I've had the opportunity to teach at a variety of different institutions, schools, and I always sort of left with the sentiment, or it reminded me of the Time Machine movie where the horn kind of goes off and the humans, you know, kind of zombie-like walk in, and then the nocturnal beasts sort of come out, and like there's this total disconnect. What's the game that these schools, institutions on kind of a larger scale that they need to play in order to kind of get out of that dark age of education?
I'm not sure what the name is. I know there's a lot of institutions that are trying things differently. We talk about Olin a lot as an example. Carnegie Mellon at one time, NYU at different times. I also think that the advent of online is also forcing some change. I think the fact that this next generation is bigger than the baby boomers, and 80% of them want to go to college is going to force a change in how we deliver education. So I think, you know, the physical reality comes into it, the people piece comes into it. But, you know, maybe it's my coming from industry, or maybe it's being an artist, but if you don't have something they want and value, they're not going to come anymore. So if education doesn't adapt, all that is going to be left is the ones like the Harvards and Yales that say, we can guarantee you your stuff for life, you know, and the rest of us will all fall. So I think we have to, it's an imperative for higher ed, especially to change. K through 12 is changing. It changes more rapidly than we do.
Ann, thank you so much. Amazing.